In 2014, we were treated to not one, but two Assassin's Creed games. Assassin's Creed Rogue for the Xbox 360 and PS3, and Assassin's Creed Unity for the next generation of consoles, the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. Obviously, at face value, this makes perfect sense. Let's do two separate games that appeal to the audience that are moving over to the new generation of consoles, but let's give the people who are still on the older generation something to tide them over and potentially double our profits. I mean, these games came out on the exact same day, so it was very intentional that they were thinking this day when Assassin's Creed launches, people are going to be able to play it no matter which console they're on, and it makes perfect sense from a business standpoint. However, it did mean that the two games were obviously going to be compared to each other, and it's strange because in one sense Assassin's Creed Unity was meant to be the big new tentpole for Assassin's Creed, launching it into the future with co-op, new updated stealth mechanics and a massive open world, all new animations, and a fresh new story that moved away from the existing narrative that had been a pretty consistent through line since Assassin's Creed 3 with the New World saga. Obviously, we know how that went. It ended up becoming the black sheep of the Assassin's Creed franchise because of its reception at launch with so many bugs, and in some cases the game was absolutely unplayable, which left Assassin's Creed Rogue as a sort of safe, friendly choice because, yes, it was made for less technically powerful hardware, but it used a lot of the mechanics that had already worked in Black Flag, and that made it quite an enjoyable title because it only had sort of the story that was new. Yes, they added some new mechanics. Obviously, they had the whole premise of you're playing as a Templar this time, which was the only selling point it really had, because when you play Assassin's Creed Rogue, it feels familiar, it feels quickly rushed together title, I'm gonna say it. Like, not quickly as in they just wanted a quick buck off of it, but they didn't have the resources or the budget perhaps there to deliver a full mainline title. And so to me, I've always seen Assassin's Creed Rogue to be in a similar ballpark to Assassin's Creed Mirage, where it's kind of like a spin-off that wraps up the New World saga in a nice bow and then naturally pivots the franchise back into the new direction that Unity was meant to sort of lead with. But I do want to ask the question, if Assassin's Creed Rogue was the only game that came out in 2014, how do you think it would have fared? Obviously, it would have to have had a bigger budget, a longer story, because the story is only 6 sequences long. Black Flag's was 13, AC3's was 12, so it would have had to have doubled the length of the story, possibly doubled the number of locations, although Rogue's world is pretty big to begin with, and it would have had to have a much more fleshed out and longer story. But could it have worked? Could it have worked as the only game to come out in 2014 and then Unity come out polished in 2015? Well, it's strange, but I'm gonna say no. I think it's a number of different factors that obviously play into this. The first of all being the Xbox One and PS4 came out in 2013, and by this point, I think Ubisoft knew that they were running out of time and they couldn't just put out Black Flag again mechanically. They had to deliver the next generation of Assassin's Creed and really leave a massive impact, because I think 2013, you had a lot of launch titles for the Xbox One and the PS4. They were all graphically astounding, but they were quite underwhelming. You know, Killzone Shadowfall, The Order 1886, Rise, Son of Rome. These are all games that have pretty much been forgotten the second they came out, because although they were presented as big launch titles to just really showcase the power of the new generation, they didn't deliver in terms of the actual quality that's expected of a lot of games that were coming out on the 360. And I think with Assassin's Creed Unity, 1 year later, by the time we got to 2014, we were starting to get games come out that had been developed specifically sort of with enough time for the Xbox One and PS4 to have existed. It wasn't just a launch title that was made using hardware that they didn't really have any idea about. By this point, they'd had other games to use as an example, and therefore Assassin's Creed Unity could be more of a tentpole and more well-oriented for the console. And I think this would have made Assassin's Creed Rogue feel very outdated if it came out during this time. Now, of course, the main argument here could be Assassin's Creed 2, Brotherhood, and Revelations. These games came out one after another year by year, and mechanically were very similar to how Black Flag and Rogue feel. So that begs the question, did Assassin's Creed Brotherhood and Revelations work so well because they were sequels, because it was a direct continuation of Ezio's story? Can you imagine Black Flag again with Edward and the exact same sort of open world structure like we got in Rogue, but it's just a continuation of the same story? Would that have been a better option than Rogue? Because of the way that Brotherhood had piggybacked off of AC2 and Revelations was piggybacking off of those games. They were building up their own sort of singular fan base outside of the main ongoing saga. Because it's funny, when we talk about Assassin's Creed 2 going into Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, we talk about the upgrades and the different story, and we never sort of say, oh, it's just an AC2 copy. Whereas when we talk about Rogue, we say, oh, it's just Black Flag again. It's exactly the same ship mechanics. And yeah, but the truth is, Assassin's Creed had the same engine and the same formula from AC2 through to Revelations, apart from the story. Now, that could also be a factor as well, because the story of Assassin's Creed Rogue, I would say, fits a spin-off more because it is very niche. Yes, it is set in a totally different time period. Yes, it's got all the things you would expect from an Assassin's Creed game. It's got historical characters, it's got massive set pieces, and it has a good flowing narrative. It's not a great story. Yes, there are definitely flaws in the way that Rogue's story plays out, and the motivations and the writing, but we have to consider that it's only 6 sequences long, and they were clearly rushing this thing together to some extent. But with all of that said, I do feel like, although the open world of Rogue feels very sort of AAA, of the standard, I don't think the story does. I think when you're watching some of the cutscenes and you're seeing some of the dialogue especially, you can feel the limitations. You can see that they've sort of been given a tight deadline, and also they've been given a set number of locations that they can tell their story in, and they're just stretching it as thin as possible just to get this thing over the 6-hour mark. And the truth of the matter is that, obviously, Unity was just a far superior game in terms of visuals, parkour, engine. That really was what Assassin's Creed needed at the time, and I don't think if you waited until 2015, I just think it would have came too late. I mean, that year had games like Batman Arkham Knight, Black Ops 3, like very visually incredible, mechanically impressive games, even though Arkham Knight was working off an old engine. And it's funny because maybe if they kept improving on the engine they were using in Revelations and, the first 4 games, by the time we got to Rogue, we could have got something that sort of maintained its quality, whereas they did this full refresh in 2012 with AC3's animations and mechanics and the way that the game felt and looked, that when we got to Black Flag, we kind of got another sort of interpretation of that by the time we got to Rogue, I feel like they didn't have sort of a solid foundation mechanically, and we know this because in Unity they swapped it out again for something completely different, a brand new engine. Look at a game like Batman Arkham Knight that came out in 2015. Arkham Knight is still using the same engine that was used in Arkham Asylum. Batman still runs the same, he still climbs janky, the movement is still stilted and awkward, and yet that is such a massive step up from anything that had came before it, and to this day, Arkham Knight is still one of the most impressive looking video games I've ever seen. It's such a visually rich game. If they kept further refining it for another year, given a massive team, not just the skeleton crew of Sophia that worked on Rogue, but if it was a Montreal, if it was a Quebec, and they delivered Assassin's Creed Rogue with visuals on the level of Unity, but with the sort of mechanics and storytelling that we saw in Black Flag and 3, could it have been a similar situation to Arkham Knight, where it surpasses the limitations of the original mechanics because they built on the engine so much? Well, then you ask the question, is it still Assassin's Creed Rogue? Rogue still looks incredible to this day, and I think the only thing that Rogue needed in terms of the entire presentation of the game is the story and the writing, because aside from that, Rogue ticks a lot of boxes for me. Pacing wise, it gets straight to it. You don't get loads of modern day stuff. When you do, it's very brief and it's not, it's annoying. I made a whole video about how good Rogue's open world is because it is genuinely so well designed. The upgrades from AC3's New York to Rogues are massive in terms of making it fun to traverse. You have the North Atlantic and the River Valley. The River Valley sort of acts like an upgrade from the Frontier. The North Atlantic is like the Black Flag style of gameplay you would expect, but it's in a brand new sort of winter ice sort of setting, so it has its own unique mechanics with the ice ram, the grenade launcher to unlock certain paths. I think the open world of Rogue is pretty perfect, and I don't think it would be improved massively. Maybe if they added like little side quests or something, but I don't think it could be improved massively in any way substantially whatsoever, which means you would only be affecting the story. And then we have to ask the question, is the story of Rogue something that could be improved with time, or were they sort of set on what they wanted to do and they achieved it? And I think, honestly, that is probably the answer. I think it was a writer that was perfectly happy with what they executed. Now, I might just be being a bit cynical here, but I do honestly feel like if you tried to change the story of Rogue, it would sort of morph into a different game entirely. I think Rogue was executed exactly how they intended it to, and I don't think, like, we couldn't say, oh, with more time the writing could have got better, because I don't think it was a rushed job in terms of writing. I think it was just a limited one, because the whole story is centered around making Shay as correct morally as possible. And I think that does sort of tell more about the mindset of the writer than the actual writing itself. Because, yeah, it works. Everything in Rogue is efficient, snappy, and gets you moving quickly. It's a very quick pace to it that I really like. The problem, I think, is just the limitations in the time that they have to tell it. I think the limitations that Rogue has is honestly just an understanding of who the Assassins and Templars are, because it's kind of similar to a Shadows situation where I just don't think they really got the gist of, like, well, I just don't think they had a writer who could convey a Templar who was once an assassin. I don't think they could wrap their head around how that would work in the philosophy that was already established. I think they genuinely just thought, okay, let's just flip the writing. Let's just make the Assassins genocidal maniacs, and let's make the Templars angels that could do no wrong. And, you know, occasionally we'll make Hatham shoot a guy in the leg to go, we're really evil, when they're not. And I think it's that kind of, I don't want to be harsh, but it is like immature writing that I think is what holds Rogue back. And I don't think they just went, oh shit, we've only got 9 months to make this, let's just flip the rules. Because you could have sat down for like a week, and come up with a proper motivated story. And I think, again, it was a niche one. This is a story that fits into the lore between Assassin's Creed 3 and 4, which is already a time period that a lot of people have already sort of gotten used to. The River Valley, like I said, it's like the Frontier. New York is literally in AC3. So I don't think you could fully market the game on being this wow, crazy new setting, because it is just a natural sequel that follows on from Black Flag and pivots us into AC3. So you couldn't do the whole Ubisoft marketing shtick of, oh, look at the new time period, look at the authentic historical accuracy. It has to sell itself on being a good game with a good story. And I just unfortunately don't think Rogue quite made it in that regard. Now, a question could certainly be made as to whether Unity made it in that regard. That's a whole other debate. They are both problematic games in terms of their narrative. With Assassin's Creed Unity, it feels at going in a totally new direction and trying something new, which is kind of commendable. At least they tried to like mix up the formula, whereas Rogue is trying to fit a puzzle piece into a story that already exists. So it has a different set of limitations. One is trying to be a faithful sequel, and one of them is trying to be like a soft reboot. So it can't really be compared. I don't think either of them achieved what it was going for, but I could argue that Rogue is the more enjoyable experience overall. But I guess with, you know, the new generation of consoles catching up so quickly, I don't think, like, okay, if the Xbox One came out in 2015, then yeah, I think you should have gone with Unity in 2015, brought out Rogue in 2014. But the fact is, I think time was moving too quickly. They couldn't get Rogue out before the new console came out. And so I think due to those limitations, or whether it was a cash grab or not, I think Rogue just had to come out eventually. I'm glad we got it. If we didn't get Rogue and we only got Unity, the New World Saga would feel incomplete. So I am grateful for that. But what do you guys think? Do you think that Rogue could have been a standalone title outside of Unity? Do you think it could have supported a whole year of Assassin's Creed if it was given the AAA sort of development costs and budget and maybe a bit more time down the pipeline to really refine the story? Let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to hype the video because that's a thing. Like the video and subscribe for more Assassin's Creed content, and I will see you in the next video.